Journalist Tara Henley has quit her role with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation because of, in her words, their woke, radical political agenda. Henley made the claim in a new column with online writing platform Substack, which is a subscription-based service where authors can publish and monetize their work. Henley said she left following a flood of complaints about the dramatic change at the CBC over the last 18 months. And Tara joins me now. Thank you so much for joining me on Free Speech Nation, Tara. Now, I'd like to ask you, Tara, about this resignation letter that you've published on the Substack. This is coming in the long line of, there's been various people who've been doing this kind of thing. I mean, most famously, there was Barry Weiss at the New York Times, and then, of course, Peter Boghossian resigning from Portland State. And this is the latest. This seems to be a trend now. Can you tell us your story? What actually happened to you?
So I have been working in media for a very long time, and I've been working at the CBC since 2013 with a break to write my book. And because I was in the producer pool, I worked in a lot of different newsrooms, a lot of different shows, both in Vancouver and in Toronto. So I got a really good sense of sort of what's happening at the network, bouncing around from shows like that. And the sort of woke worldview had always been in the building, but over the last 2 years, those views have become more extreme and they have become more pervasive. And the ability to voice opposing views has been less and less possible. Now, I won't say that I didn't voice it. I voiced it all the time in the newsroom, but it was just more and more difficult to get different perspectives on the air. And I started to really puzzle over this woke worldview. I didn't understand where it was coming from. And so I've been researching it for about the last year and a half. And it is strange in that it promotes itself as leftism, but it is so illiberal. And so I think it's very puzzling to the public. And you mentioned the complaints.
Tara, where would you say you stood politically yourself?
So I'm on the left, very firmly on the left, and always have been. But my understanding of the woke perspective is that it is not traditionally leftist. As I mentioned, it's illiberal. It's not very concerned with the material conditions of people's lives. It's much more interested in talking about language and representation. And there is nothing wrong with the woke worldview being represented. I would like it to be one of the views in the room. I just don't want it to be the only view in the room.
And where do you think this is coming from? I mean, is this just something that's happened? Is it a generational thing? Is it that there are younger members of staff coming in? Or is this a general attitudinal shift that we're just seeing across the Western world?
I think we're seeing this in newsrooms all across the Western world. And I think that's why, as you mentioned before, we're seeing so many journalists now slowly begin to object to it and to say that this is not good for journalism and it's not good for democracy. In the case of, my newsrooms that I worked in, I could see a lot of sort of pressures bearing down on the newsroom. There was Twitter, which has an undue influence, which presents the woke worldview as a consensus view when it is absolutely not in the public. You also had economic concerns kind of bearing down on the newsroom. It's a collapsing business. There was a lot of use of precarious employment. And so people working in the newsroom were having to audition for their jobs every day, which does not lend itself well to speaking out on things. And then on top of that, you had the top-down pressures. You had the sort of ideologically based diversity initiatives that were being sort of mandated from the very top. And to be clear, I am not arguing against diversity in any way. I'm arguing for more diversity. I'm arguing for the range of perspectives to be increased, not just through a racial lens, but also through economics and education and region and religious beliefs. So I'm arguing for more views to be represented.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because when we see sort of conservative journalists such as Andrew Sullivan leaving and going exclusively to Substack and doing very well, I might add, we often think, well, that makes more sense because there's a sort of overwhelming left bias within journalism. Now, you're coming from a leftist perspective yourself. Would you say that a lot of left-wing people are increasingly disillusioned with what is going on here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm hearing more and more criticism of the woke movement privately. And what I'm arguing for is let's have this discussion in public. Let's hear those criticisms publicly now. Of course, there's quite a cost to speaking out against this. And I think that's another thing that this last week has really demonstrated. And I don't feel victimized in any way, but nobody wants to be called horrible names on the internet. And so it really disincentivizes this conversation. And I think that we need to start having the conversation in public and to incentivize this conversation.
And can you give any specific examples? Because I think some people will be thinking, well, what is it specifically that happened to you while you were working for the CBC? Were there any instances where you were told not to say certain things or that you had to present certain stories in a certain light? Is there anything specific like that?
So I think that the best way to look at this is that in newsrooms, that's not really how it works. No one says you can't say this or you can't talk to that person for the most part, although that does happen once in a while. It's more about the atmosphere and the mood. It's more about where the interest level is. So the interest level for woke stories is very high. The interest level for stories like on the housing crisis or the opioid crisis, which people see as depressing, is very low. You will have less dissenting voices in the newsroom because everyone's on Twitter and people don't see opposing views. And so it just keeps pushing it slowly and slowly and slowly. I think a good example that I saw this happening was the Dave Chappelle story. So the coverage was very much in one direction. We heard activists talking about why this special was problematic. We didn't hear other voices about, this is a beloved comic. There are lots of people that did not find this comedy special to be problematic. There are a lot of people who found it to be interesting social commentary. We didn't hear those views. And that one was a particular turning point for me, A, because I love comedy, B, because I love Dave Chappelle, and C, because I had started my career in hip hop, and Dave Chappelle comes out of that world. And so I felt very sort of emotionally invested in him as a comic, and to see the great sort of support for him not reflected, I found that very odd and very puzzling.
Do you think there's a sense in which there's a change of perception in terms of what a journalist's role is, rather than sort of deliver the information, deliver the truth, but to almost preach and to express the correct message to the people? Does it have a kind of negative view of humanity's ability to make their own minds up about a story?
I would agree with that characterization, and that is certainly something that I hear from the public all the time, that the public does not want to be scolded. The public does not want to be told what decisions to make. For the most part, I think the public would like us to present the broad range of views right across the spectrum and allow them to take that information, to take those facts, to take those opinions and make up their own minds on where to go. And I think part of the problem with journalism now is that journalism has begun to think of itself as responsible for the decisions of the public and responsible for influencing public behavior. And I think that's a mistake.
Well, Tara, this is a really fascinating story, and I would urge people to have a read of your piece about this on Substack. Thanks so much for joining me tonight on Free Speech Nation.
Thank you for having me.